creativity doesn't do very well under pressure. And if the focus is just on sort of moving faster, which is the unspoken or the unquestioned rather kind of value of tech, really, at least. And so, I think that time to noodle and explore something, you can't do that if you are under pressure. And when you're under pressure, what people tend to do when they're making stuff is they fall back on two things. They fall back on the stuff they've done before or they've seen others do before. And they also lean into what the technology they're using does well, right, and does easily.
Welcome to Insights Unlocked, an original podcast from User Testing, where we bring you candid conversations and stories with the thinkers, doers, and builders behind some of the most successful digital products and experiences in the world, from concept to execution.
Welcome to the Insights Unlocked podcast. I'm Nathan Isaacs, Principal Content Marketing Manager at User Testing. Joining us today as host is Jason Giles, User Testing's Vice President of Product Design. Hi there, Jason.
Hello, Nathan. Hello, everyone. It's nice to be back.
And our guest today is Dr. Andy Polaine. Andy is a design leadership coach, educator, and writer with 3 decades of experience helping clients transform their organizations and themselves. He is the co-author of Service Design From Insight to Implementation. Welcome to the show, Andy.
Hello. Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
Andy, this is really exciting to have you on. I can't believe we haven't met before. We obviously know a lot of other folks, and I've been really enjoying some of the writing that you do. To kind of get us grounded and get started, you've had this really amazing career that spanned a few decades. And, carving your way through industry, academia, and then a lot of work in coaching. And as you look back on that experience, are there some specific through lines that you feel like have really shaped how you think about design and design leadership today?
Yeah, there are actually. And it came together. I was talking with someone, and as I was talking to them, I sort of had this whole thing of like, oh, right, and now I see how all these things fit together. I think, the beginning of my career was early 90s, very early 90s, before really interaction design or UX or any of those things had the names. And we were working in this new media, as it was called then, interactive media, and exploring it as a medium, trying to understand it and trying to understand, what is being able to make interactive stuff and put it out there in the world mean. Now that, non-programmers can do it, and we were noodling around doing lots of stuff like that and trying to sort of understand the medium. And out of that came lots of experiments that really helped us explore the affordances, I would say, of interactivity. And, quite a lot of those, I'm not saying we discovered those independent. Well, we did discover them independently. I'm not saying we sort of invented those. But there are lots of things that we see now in interfaces or every day that were things that we were also discovering as other people were discovering them back then. So there's that aspect of it, of always being interested in, what is this, not just what can this technology do, but why is it interesting and may or may not be important kind of culturally. I'd always done a lot of teaching. I was teaching, I was quite good at what I was doing, that interactive stuff when I was a student, and I was often helping my study colleagues, but then straight afterwards I started teaching because there wasn't really anyone to teach that stuff. And I think there was a point when I was the head of school of media arts at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. And there was a few moments there when I realized some things around leadership. There was some stuff before, actually, when I worked at a company called Animal Logic, where I realized some things around leadership. But in teaching, I definitely saw that people blocked themselves a lot. I'd have students come in and they'd, be in tears in my office and things. And I realized this didn't really have anything to do with their craft abilities. It was also to do with their relationship to themselves. And then I think, later on, I realized that all the stuff around design leadership and leadership in general, I think is people stuff. And so that's what all comes together in the coaching. And I've had a long, my ex-wife is a Jungian psychotherapist, and we both did many years of analysis. Just can't be married to one without doing it, and you can't be one without doing it. And so there's a lot of self-discovery and understanding that's come from that over 27, 28 years, and it all sort of flows in together, I think.
Do you find that that there's fundamentally anything different around the creative pursuits, design, the orientation there that is unique in terms of the people skills in unblocking themselves, or have you found that in general that those tend to be just truths across the various disciplines?
There's a thing I talk about called the sort of design leadership dip, and it's very much the creative leadership dip. But I think it's also goes for, I've spoken to people in medicine and people and engineers and people like that who talk about this too, which is you build an identity by doing a thing. Right? In design, we make things, we make artifacts, and a lot of our identity at the beginning is how well you can make those artifacts, how quickly you can sometimes make them, and how creative you are and so forth. And at some point, as you move into a leadership and management role, you start doing less of that, and you're starting managing and leading people, and that's the people and relationships bit. And that bit doesn't get taught in design school, right? I mean, it does in mine. I teach my students that, but it doesn't get taught in design school usually. And if you're lucky, you've had a good role model or a mentor, as you've been moving up. And if you haven't, if everyone else is unlucky, you've had a really bad one and you copy that person, right? And so I think that what happens there is you sort of start to lack confidence in your craft skills, and you also are new at the other thing. And that's why I call it a dip, although I think it's more like a roller coaster. I think there's several dips. But there's definitely this sort of moment of crisis, which sort of coincides with a bit of a midlife, mid-career crisis anyway, which, pretty much from kindergarten onwards, you've kind of been following this script of like, oh, this is the next step, this is the next step, right? And people have basically been telling you what you need to do. And then you hit this thing, Jung called it the sort of the middle passage, this sort of phase between the first and second halves of life, where you've sort of got to where you're aiming for, right? You're the head of design or whatever you are, design director, and probably didn't think much after that. And then there's this real moment of, well, now I'm here. Is this really what I want? Is this is this what it's about? I'm not really sure I like this. And all of that stuff goes on. And so I think there's something about creating stuff for a living. I think people who don't do that for a living, where they're in a business role where they're obviously doing things, but there's something you do in design or any other creative industry where you pull something out of you each time and you put it up for critique. And I think people who don't do that don't know, how hard that can be sometimes. And so I think the confidence hit is sometimes a bit stronger because of that, because you build this very strong identity to sort of carry you through that critique. And then as you start to dismantle it, it can be quite alarming. And anyway, look, I know designers, so that's the path that I've trod. And so that's why I mostly coach them.
It is, what you said just resonates so strongly with me personally. And, it's interesting because, fortunately, I've been able to find that working with people is just, I've reframed it as another design problem, or managing people through change or chaos. And maybe it doesn't quite have the same type of critique factor involved, but that has kept me very engaged. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about what's going on right now is there is a bunch of change being introduced. New technology capabilities are really introducing, maybe they're challenging some of the ways that we've worked, the way that we've been able to interact with, certainly with computers. But, as you were talking before, you used a couple of words in kind of your past of noodling, of experimenting. I think you used the word play. And I think, possibly we're in a time where some of that is actually coming back. And so maybe you could talk a little bit more around, why is that exploration important? Why is that play? And possibly how can they make a space for it without feeling that they're just being unproductive, that they're just goofing around?
Yeah, so that last bit you just said sort of goes to the heart of it, where I think we are trained, and and it's particularly I'd argue a sort of North American thing, that you should spend every hour of your life being productive, right? And I don't think that's true at all. And it's quite a modern phenomenon, right? In the past, even if you were sort of subsistence sort of farming, you're doing that, but there's also quite a lot of doing nothing. And it's very seasonal too, which is a whole other thing because you get the time to kind of look inwards and all the rest of it. I think the noodling thing. So the thing that I was talking about, we were experimenting, and you need some time to experiment. Like creativity doesn't do very well under pressure, right? Under massive. I mean, it kind of can in the sense of like, a deadline. I'm an arch procrastinator, so sort of deadlines and things like that, they can force creativity. And that's not quite what I mean. I think that I mean more like that sort of inspirational searching thing that often needs some time. And if the focus is just on sort of moving faster, which is the unspoken or the unquestioned rather kind of value of tech, really, at least, is, or of digital is, faster is better. And I don't think it always is. And so, I think that time to noodle and explore something, you can't do that if you are under pressure. And when you're under pressure, what people tend to do when they're making stuff is they fall back on two things. They fall back on the stuff they've done before or they've seen others do before. And they also lean into what the technology they're using does well, right, and does easily. So, there was a whole bunch of stuff, if you remember the days of Flash and Illustrator and all of that, and partly it was a file size thing, but that whole sort of vector art look that arose in the, I guess, sort of late 90s, early 2000s. It was a thing that the tool really left its mark on that stuff. And I've attributed this quote to John Mader. That's who I heard said it, but I've never found it. He said back then, Adobe is the world's art director. And we would have said Figma probably a little while ago and probably say Claude now, because, the tools leave their mark. They always leave their signature on stuff. This is really the thing that people are saying when they talk about slop, right? Is that you can kind of see the marks of the tool. And when you have time to noodle about and you don't have this idea that, I have to be making something that's productive, I have to be making something that has, a commercial value of some kind, and you're just exploring, you discover all sorts of other things. And I think that, I said in my newsletter the other day, I think digital product design, and I'd probably argue physical product design, has been pretty boring in the last 10, 15 years maybe. Because it's all got very standardized and it's done, it's been quite useful for a lot of things, right? But once you've got a design system in place and the sort of back's been broken of that kind of work, and you're a sort of junior, mid, even senior designer working with an existing design system, and you're being forced to go fast, then you don't have the time to kind of explore the edges of that. You're just churning stuff out. And it kind of meant everything got very standardized, and the sort of age of average hit, everything starts to look the same. It's the sort of wind tunnel effect, right? And I think that's a bit of a shame. And I think that noodling is really, really important. And so one of the things that is kind of happening with AI is that you've got tools, whether it's Claude Code or whatever stuff, or Lovable, or whatever people are using, where people who are non-programmers can once again make interactive stuff and put it out there in the world. And I don't mean a sort of clickable Figma thing. I mean, something that can do stuff. Because that all went away when Flash died, basically. Flash and Director and early days of HTML and CSS allowed people to noodle. Daniel Brown used to have a website called Noodlebox. And then it all went away, and now we sort of need all this massive infrastructure of AI to do it all over again. A bit like we all need kind of hundreds of satellites surrounding the world and the supercomputer in our pocket to do what we used to do with a map. It's kind of a shame in some respects, but I think it's interesting to see people explore again. And that means also non-programmers, non-designers, That also, so whether it's in the classic trio, whether it's a PM engineer or designer, they all get the chance to noodle again. And I think some interesting stuff might come out of that.
Do you, for either practitioners or for leaders of creatives, do you think there's a reframing of experimentation, or as you say, noodling or play, that is helpful in creating space for that? Do you find that there's practical applications of, or practical practices that, it feels like today, I know I hear it a lot from my team. I'm like, hey, like there's all these opportunities, there's these tools, we make them available to you stuff. And yet I am still driving for delivery and production and quality and all those types of things. Do you have thoughts on how, as individuals or as leaders of teams, creating an environment for that can be effective?
Yeah. One of my coachees asked me a really interesting question. I thought the way she framed it was really good, which was, she said, what's my responsibility as a leader regarding my team and their usage of AI? She said, I'm not going to just run out and buy licenses for everything. And they have a job to be doing, but at the same time, I don't want to tell them to not touch it either, because clearly for some people it's going to be important in their careers. And so we talked about this quite a lot. And I guess a lot of my thinking came out of that question. So you said the thing just now, a lot of your job's focused on, delivery and production and quality, but it's usually the quality suffers, right? So there's a kind of few things I think that are practical about it. One is this thing that designers can actually go back and polish the stuff that, is always, oh yeah, we'll get around to doing that sometime, but not within this sprint. And then it just, I liken it to sort of something dropping off of a speedboat, and some people going, oh, we'll go back for that in a minute, but not right now. And then by the time you do it, you look behind you and it's so far away, you just go, just get on to the next thing. And so those things, the designers being able to actually do the polish and ship the code, themselves, that's kind of an opportunity. I think with the other stuff, I still question the speed thing. There's a lot of things that don't have to be done fast. I'm not saying everyone goes back to some grindingly slow waterfall process, although a lot of supposedly agile processes in organizations are kind of really waterfall now anyway. I think that if you're a large, Grammarly, the Grammarly debacle was a really good example of this. If you're an existing brand and not a startup running out of money, it makes sense to take 2, 4, even 6 to 8 weeks longer to do something and get it out there and get it right than it is to throw something out there really quickly and get it wrong. The idea that we need to move fast and break things for an existing brand doesn't make much sense. Car companies don't do this for a reason, right? Because of the safety, apart from Tesla, and look where they're at. And there is for a lot of brands. I worked with a supermarket in Switzerland, and they had this thing going on where they would, they brought out a new app, and it was a bit of a rubbish version of the previous one, and their customers are really annoyed. So why would you do that, right? There's 2 main supermarkets in Switzerland. There's no real first mover advantage that anyone has, right? And you see it all over the place. I'd much prefer that Zoom, for example, actually fixed a lot of their UX than just kept adding stuff in. So, we've taken that, copy and pasted that sort of startup mentality and applied it to everything. And I think often just going a little bit slower to get it right makes sense. Now, the promise of AI is always, well, it's going to free up the time for us to do the more strategic work, to do all of that stuff. And if it does, then great. And I would argue that some of the noodling is an important part of that time. Like, here are these tools. What does it enable us to do? What can we do with these things that we couldn't do before? And when I say what can we do, I don't just mean the sort of technical output. I mean, how does it shape the way that we work together? And, as people, how can we have different kinds of conversations due to these tools, rather than we're just going to do more of the same but faster? That seems to be to me to be a really lost opportunity, to just do more stuff faster.
Yeah, kind of to your point. the tools themselves lend themselves to specific applications, and that tends to be what gets adopted first. And where I get inspired, we've enabled our team pretty freely with the tools that they want, is the applications that are adjacent or things that I wouldn't have considered before, of rethinking entire workflows or turning things on their head. And I really applaud that. And it kind of goes back to not just the prioritizing the time to experiment and play, but to pause a little bit and think about really so many facets of what we're doing. Could this be done completely different now? Like we're in this habitual mode, whether it's the design process at a macro level or just even on our daily habits or rituals. And I think this is why I love having a good sized team of very diverse designers, because they come up with all sorts of really, really cool applications. I'm just like, oh, okay. And I think we're just touching the surface, but I wanted to get back to something that you kind of touched on before, was with the opportunity for, the technology is enabling many others to get back to the old days of, hey, whip up some HTML and build a website, or, I can use Flash. It's making the production of something where people can actually use. It's reduced the barrier there. And I think, and I feel, and I talk to a lot of designers, like a lot are kind of going through a little bit of an identity crisis. This used to be my stuff. I built my career around my little walled garden of specific capabilities or familiarity with tools that others haven't had that opportunity. And so I guess, do you think that with these new capabilities that it's actually changing what we're valuing from designers, from design work? Does it raise the bar for what should be expected as a designer as they think about their own identity? Do you have thoughts on really what does it mean to be a designer now?
I think what it means to be a designer now is actually what it meant to be a designer about 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. For all the good stuff that the rise of product and product-led companies have done, it did push design down into the kind of assembly line. And prior to that, design had spent many decades trying to become more strategic and work their way up the food chain. And I think that one of the mistakes that's happened, I kind of understand there's a sort of economic reason why this happened, right? Which is all the high paid jobs were in product, whether it's product leadership or product design or whatever else. And everyone kind of rebadged themselves to get those jobs. People say, well, I've been doing product for 30 years. They just have not, because it didn't, it's 17, 18 years old at best, framed in the way that we understand it now. And obviously people have been doing activities that are now done in product design. But they certainly weren't called that. And it kind of munged together a whole bunch of different disciplines, right? If UX, interaction design, information architecture, and UI, and all of those different aspects, research too. And it kind of munged it all together into one discipline. And I think that has been a real mistake on sort of design's part, to do that or to allow that to happen. But like I said, I think there are sort of economic reasons why that happened and sort of power reasons why that happened. I think if I remember Flash designers, right? I remember people saying, I'm a Flash designer. And I remember thinking back then, hey, Flash is going to go away. I remember saying to my students, and they were like, oh, no, it's never going to go away, Andy. And I was like, I used to build stuff in Director, and I know that's going away. That stuff's going to go away one day. And it will. And so if you peg your career on a particular, being a kind of operator of a particular technology or tool, then yeah, it's a real problem for you. But if really the tools are just a means to execute the stuff that you've been thinking about and the way you think and your ability to articulate those things, then it kind of doesn't really matter, right? And so all the people I know who have been in this world for quite a long time, have shifted as the tools have shifted around them. There's a similar thing that went on in in the visual effects world, actually, in which was, it used to be that visual effects meant buying really expensive computers, like the silicon graphics things that look like a fridge, that cost like, $1 million or something. And basically the economic model of it is you would rent that out at, stupid amount of money per hour. And those people who were working those machines were initially called operators, like when things like Flame and Harry and stuff like that. They were Flame operators, and eventually they became called Flame artists because of that kind of shift of like, well, it's not just about the tool. I'm just not just operating a thing. I'm not just a director's pair of hands at the keyboard. And so I think, once you kind of escape that and you're able to articulate why you think a certain thing, your approach, trace it back to some research or whatever it is that you're doing as a designer, that's really the kind of value you bring. And, one of the interesting things about AI tools is that when that stuff gets embedded in skills, those markdown files, which is really just someone writing out, hey, here's what quality means, right? And it's kind of fascinating to look at, right? When you look at that stuff and you see like the impeccable ones, for example, there's a whole bunch of stuff around, rhythm and spacing, or, in the typography one, or there's a whole bunch of different ones. And it's the ability to articulate your decisions that's really, really important. And that's where if you've been down the end of kind of just working with someone else's design system, the thing I wrote in my newsletter is it's a bit like making scenes with Playmobil, right? Yeah, you can make a scene, but you can't change, all the fundamental design and creative decisions have already been made. And so I think that's one of the kind of differentiators in terms of people's careers. So in some respects, I've seen people saying things like, "Oh, the new thing in design is really about the why," and I'm like, "Really? That's not the new thing in design. That's always been around." And fundamentally, design is about looking at the world, thinking, I think it could be better in a different way, and then manifesting that in some way. And there's always this mix of humility and ego, right? With designing, there's this sort of ego to say, I think this could be different, and here's my idea for it, and I'm going to make it and put it out there in the world. And then there's the humility in that you really have to, understand other people and work with other people in other disciplines.
Yeah. I really love that framing. It really resonates where, the tools will continue to change, the mediums that we play with, but it's almost is unlocking this opportunity for design to get back to what it always was about, was really deeply understanding humans and creatively providing solutions or opportunities for them to do things in amazing new ways.
I mean, one of the things, this is also going to all go away. I mean, it's going to change radically, as we all know. There's just the kind of physics of it, right? The enormous resource consumption of it is an impossible barrier that AI is going to hit. We struggle enough with everything else in the world to cover it with renewables, let alone, just adding a kind of massive energy guzzling engine to it. But also financially, it's obviously going to break. I mean, the bubble is, I'm been around like you probably long enough to have been through a couple of bubbles, and it is definitely, the air is already going out of it, I'd suggest. But the AI bubble is definitely going to burst at some point. And I think the question that I keep coming back to is this idea, if this stuff was costing us 10 times the amount that it currently costs, which is probably sort of at least what it should, would we be doing the same stuff with it? And my guess is probably not. I think there's a lot of things people go, I'm going to do that by hand. There's no point in spending that energy or money doing it. So I'm interested. I know it sounds really negative, but I'm looking forward to the bubble bursting, apart from the collateral damage of it, with all that sort of money getting sucked out of the system. But from a technology and sort of cultural point of view, whatever comes afterwards will be the interesting stuff.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. It's interesting to see we're already developing skills on how to optimize for credit usage. Like that's becoming a new skill that who would have thought even a year ago would have been kind of a core competency of using with these tools, which says a lot around where we're at as far as within that kind of curve of the bubble. Just want to kind of switch gears one last time and kind of think about, I've been spending a lot of time kind of rejoicing in the sense where, over the past few years, particularly in digital product, shipping was the big finish line. And that's the moment that you celebrate, we got this thing out there. And increasingly, I've seen it more and more difficult for teams to be like, okay, well, like, how's it actually doing in the market? How is it changing people's lives? Is it being effective or not? And on one side of me, I'm a little bit concerned because now shipping is technically easy. You can get stuff out to market very quickly. Do you have concerns whether there's kind of aspects of what we do as designers, as researchers, as product creators? Are there hard parts that we're kind of starting to skip as part of the way that AI is changing the way that we work?
This is really the argument for noodling, actually, because I think some of the deeper thinking happens while you're noodling. But if I just define noodling, I mean exploring a medium, exploring an idea in different ways and kind of turning it over. I guess, it's a segue from kind of doodling, right? When we used to design by hand, and there's plenty of design professions that still do this, we would do lots and lots and lots of sketches of things and find the form and all of that. And one of my favorite examples of this, because I used to live in Sydney, is the Sydney Opera House, right? Jørn Utsen's, you can look at it all online, Jørn Utsen's sketches for this. And there's this iterative backwards and forwards, like I have it on my desktop, actually, as my desktop picture. This kind of quick sketch of the Opera House and these kind of palm leaves. It's like, oh, this is what I kind of want it to look like. And then at some point it goes into quite a lot of detail. He's making prototypes, maquettes, and all of these things and drawing up quite detailed plans. And then realize that something's not going to work and go back to that sketchy stage of things. And it took him like 2 years to get the segmenting right on the sails of the Opera House. And there's a guy called John Warwicker, who is one of the founders of Tomato, who we used to kind of work with. And he said, I used to like it when computers were slower, because whilst the progress bar was going along when I was applying some blur or something in Photoshop, I'd go and make a cup of coffee and think about what I want to do next. And so time, that kind of in-between time is really, really useful. And I think when you are able to go straight from an idea to manifesting it, or worse, sort of half an idea and prompting it and just taking whatever that comes back from the prompt, that's the real shortcut. That's the problem, I would say, because you can't unsee it once you've seen it. And you've then skipped a whole load of that kind of working through things and the thinking that goes on, and the thing about design thinking that was the problem, if you like, was that it made it sound like there was no thought done after that bit of thinking had been done. Like we think for a bit and then we just make and deliver. And I think that's been the model quite a lot recently, in the last 10 years. And I think actually, but 2/3 of the thinking happens while you're designing, right? That thing of as you're sketching, everyone's had this when they've been sketching a wireframe sequence or something, and they're, oh, hang on, that's not going to work. I've sort of designed myself into a corner here. Now that I see it, that's never going to work because in our heads, we have this platonic ideal, this utopian ideal of how this thing's going to work. And then when we make it manifest, it's like, oh, no, that doesn't work at all. And so I think there's some stuff there that we are in danger of skipping by going straight from sort of half-baked thought to prompted output. And I think we, like anything else, we have to kind of use those tools. If you're like, no, I have some intent here, and what I'm doing with this tool here is to try and manifest my intent, and I'm going to keep prodding it until I get there, or come up with different ideas. That's very different from just having a half-baked thing and just taking whatever is delivered by the tool in question.
Yeah, sometimes I really struggle because some of the efficiency, there's clearly a theme around speed and slowness here in this conversation, which I really appreciate. But the efficiencies can be so seductive. Just recently, we did a bunch of research, and obviously, like, AI is great at like synthesizing things. And I saw something that was a little maybe off. And I sat and I watched a whole session and watched this participant interact and it was just interesting. Like there was a moment of like feeling present and observing and actually watching this person doing what they're doing that hit me in a way that I realized in that moment. I'm like, oh, I'm going to need to be careful. Like that connection to this human who was interacting with this prototype that, one of my designers had was really powerful, in a way that the summary or the automated kind of results of this test. And so it'll be interesting to see if there's other instances of that. I think there's an importance of mindfulness as we use these new capabilities for losing something that isn't maybe around productivity. It's about something, a deeper connection to meaning, to understanding, to, to something real.
I think there's definitely, humans are very, very, very sensitive and hardwired for relating and human connection. Right? I think the reason why we have that ick feeling when we're on the receiving end of slop is it just feels a little bit off. It's this sort of uncanny valley effect as well. The closer we get to it, seeming like someone has written this, the more we're sensitive to the fact it's not. And I've had numerous things recently where I've read a thing and I'm like, this smells of LLM. And when I prod, it is. And the same with watching the stuff. It's really impressive what, the generative, what stuff can be generated or, image wise or video wise. And yet it's the same thing again. You can see the signature of the tool on it a little bit. And it's something gives you that ick feeling. And I think it depends on the context, right? Actually someone said it about, silly kind of pet videos or animal videos the other day. And there was all these sort of amazing videos or fluke things that happen, and they become memes and stuff on Instagram and TikTok of a cat doing a kind of interesting, funny thing. And as soon as you have a moment of like, oh no, hang on, that's an AI that's generated that, it completely loses its meaning, right? It's no longer, isn't it amazing that animal did that thing?
It's just a stupid video now.
It's just a stupid video, right? And I think this is the reason why Sora kind of has been shuttered, actually, because it's kind of interesting at the beginning and then it's just not. It gets boring quite quickly. But I think the connection thing is really important. I've been thinking, my job is to coach people, right? So I've been thinking quite a lot about, why would someone use me instead of using Claude or ChatGPT or whatever? Quite apart from the fact that there's no data privacy with those tools. When I'm coaching someone, there's stuff that we talk about, and if someone will say something, a conflict they've got or something they've got going on at work, and then they go, yeah, but it doesn't really bother me. And then we talk about it for another 10 minutes. I said, this actually does bother you, because we've been talking about it for 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. Or I see someone, I hear the little waver in someone's voice, or I see their eyes go a little bit glassy or them flush red, all those things that we read as humans because we're such social animals. And it's those things that I'm looking for. I'm going, okay, there's a thing there. And I'll, depending on the person and the context, I'll kind of follow that thing up. And it gets lost. It doesn't get just lost because of text, but it also gets lost because of the dynamic of how you're interacting with something that, does a very good facsimile of seeming like it's human and intelligent, but actually there's just nothing behind it. And so, that's why you would come to a human coach instead of, or a human therapist or whatever, instead of using an AI, because you're just missing that human connection. And I think I suspect it's one of those things that the more we engage with it, the more we realize that that's a really important thing.
Yeah. I totally concur. There's almost I'm developing a spidey sense when I feel disconnected, when I feel like I've been interacting synthetically too much. And I can't put my finger on it yet, but there's just something there. And it's, human.
I think it's like eating, a load of junk food, where it's like, I've eaten a lot of stuff, but I actually don't feel nourished at all.
Yeah.
That's what I think is going on.
Well, Andy, I can tell you, I've really enjoyed this human-to-human connection, this conversation. Very meaningful. Boy, you have done a lot. You wrote the book on service design. You got a second edition coming out there.
There it is. Yeah. It's it came out in October. Last year.
Are there any highlights that you know from the book that might relate to this this age that we're going in?
Yeah, there is actually. Now, just as you were saying it, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the first thing is we went through the whole book. Actually, Laveran, so I have two co-authors, Laveran's lovely and Ben Reason. And Laveran said, I think we should make it into a pamphlet. I think we should take as much stuff out instead of just adding to it. And of course, we didn't. It actually has more stuff in than it did. But we did edit some stuff out too. But we went through and we went, when we wrote the first book, it was like 14, 15 years ago. And so, looking back, actually, it's not that long ago, 12 years ago. Looking back over that time, and at the beginning, it was like, well, we think service design could do this, and now being able to look back and go, okay, now we know. Now we've got a whole bunch of case studies. There's service design, particularly in government, all over the place. And interestingly, I've been seeing quite a lot of service design jobs recently, and I think it's partly that sort of glue work that service design does. So, when you've got kind of quite siloed teams again, and some kind of product teams have ended up like that. Yeah, the service design people can often work sort of horizontally across that. So there's a whole bunch of case studies, the sort of proof of the impact and all of those kinds of things are in there. We went through and we rewrote every chapter. But there's a couple of things. One, we had a sort of prediction chapter of like the future of service design at the end. So that was interesting to revisit. But we added a new chapter, which was about organizational change. And it was the kind of missing bit. And it's the thing that relates to what we were just talking about, which is we realized that, we do service design projects, and it kind of generally involves an organization becoming service design led, or, everyone becoming service designers, if you like, or recognizing that everyone is part of creating and delivering that service in the organization. And it ends up being an organizational change methodology. And so, often the organizations weren't really ready to receive the work that we were creating as service designers. And they would sort of get this stuff and they go, we don't know what to do with this. We don't know how to sort of operationalize it. And a lot of the work turned out to be human relational work, right? It turned out to be, aligning stakeholders, realizing there's a lot of fear and anxiety about this on a really human level. Whether it is the senior stakeholders who had commissioned the work, or whether it's someone who's working sort of on the front line who you're basically saying, hey, the way you've been working for the last 10 years, we're going to change it now. And that's really jittery, makes people really jittery. And realizing that, in fact, a big chunk of the service design work is that much more than it is any of the kind of artifacts or whatever that people create. And I think there's a link there. There's some stats in the book, which I can't remember off the top of my head, but a large majority, it's like 3/4 of technology transformation projects fail. And they fail because of the human aspect is not taken into account. And so this is kind of the same thing all over again with AI.
Yeah, 100%. I'm very looking forward to the reading the new book for sure. Where would our audience find out more about the book and about just you and what you're up to?
So the book is at rosenfeldmedia.com, and you'll find it there. That's the best place to buy it, but you can also get it on Amazon and the rest of it. And people can find me at polaine.com, POLAINE.com. If you go to their /Linktree, I think I've got a page that sort of has all my socials everywhere else, but you'll find me on LinkedIn. I kind of hang out on Blue Sky a bit, but I have given up quite a lot of the other social media. So LinkedIn is probably the main bit, and my website. And then I have a YouTube channel and a podcast too. The podcast is called Power of 10. And the YouTube channel, I have these coaching reflections. Sometimes there's a pattern that comes up in a week or two of the same thing is coming up with my coachees. And so I usually record a little short video about it and put it up there. But they will go on my website too.
Amazing. Well, I will go check those out as well. Andy, thank you for a very human conversation. It's been a real pleasure to meet you. And yes, and I'm sure all the listeners will really enjoy this episode. So thanks again for being a guest.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on.